Welcome to Just a Little Creepy. My name is Tracy, and here's today's story. Imagine believing your body is made of glass, so fragile that a single touch could shatter you into 1,000 pieces. This wasn't just a nightmare for Francis King Charles VI in the 15th century, it was his reality. Known to history as the Mad King, Charles lived with a strange and haunting delusion that shaped his rule, terrified his court, and left his legacy wrapped in mystery. This is the bizarre story of the Glass King. Charles VI became King of France in 1380 at only 11 years old. At first, he was called Charles the Beloved. France had been torn apart by the 100 Years' War, and Charles promised stability. He was charming, intelligent, and eager to rule. But as he grew older, cracks began to appear, not in glass, but in his mind. At 24 years old in 1392, Charles suffered his first terrifying mental breakdown. During a military expedition, he suddenly turned on his own men, attacking them with a sword in a violent frenzy. When it ended, several of his knights lay dead. The king had no memory of what he had done. It was the first sign of something deeply wrong. Over the years, Charles' episodes became more frequent. He would forget who he was or fail to recognize his wife and children. He refused to bathe for months and months, his skin infected until he was bathed by force. Sometimes he believed he was made of different materials, and then most famously came the delusion of glass. Charles became convinced that his body was made entirely of glass. He feared that if anyone touched him, he would break. To protect himself, he wore specially reinforced clothing, iron rods put into his clothing, and protected himself in all sorts of ways so that he might not fall and break. He refused to let people come too close. Courtiers described how he would sit motionless for hours, afraid to move in case he shattered. This wasn't just paranoia for Charles, it was reality. And he wasn't alone. Doctors in the Middle Ages recorded cases of glass delusion, a rare psychological disorder where sufferers believed they were fragile, hollow, or even transparent. But no case was as famous as the King of France himself. Charles's illness couldn't have come at a worse time. France was still embroiled in a war with England. The king's episodes left him unfit to rule, and power shifted to his relatives and advisors. The court became the nest of political intrigue. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, was accused of infidelity. His uncles and cousins fought bitterly for control. The people lost faith in their monarch. The once beloved king became known as Charles the Mad. And through it all, Charles lived in fear of breaking, a prisoner of his own mind. So what was happening to him? Modern historians and psychiatrists believe Charles VI may have suffered from a combination of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or periods of severe psychosis triggered by stress and trauma. His erratic behavior, violent outbursts, and paranoid delusions line up with symptoms that we now recognize as major mental illnesses. The glass delusion itself is especially fascinating to modern psychology. Many experts see it as an extreme form of somatic delusion, a fixed false belief about the body. Similar delusions are still seen today in schizophrenia or depressive psychosis, where patients might believe that they are hollow, made of metal, or missing organs. In Charles's case, glass represented both fragility and transparency, turning a metaphor into lived reality. But in the late Middle Ages, there was no such thing as psychiatry. Mental illness was poorly understood, often seen through the lenses of religion, superstition, or moral weakness. There were no hospitals dedicated to treatment, no medications, and very little compassion. The options range from isolation and restraint to prayer, pilgrimage, or exorcism. For a king, that sometimes meant seclusion in a guarded chamber, or the court simply enduring his episodes because there was no cure. While the glass delusion has all but disappeared today, it's often cited as an example of how mental illness is shaped by its time and culture. Just as modern patients may fixate on radiation, surveillance, or technology, medieval minds might have turned to glass as a symbol of their deepest fears. Charles VI wasn't the only one to suffer from what became known as the glass delusion. Across Europe in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, there were records of nobles, scholars, and even royalty who believed they were made of fragile glass. One of the most notable was Princess Alexandra Amalie of Bavaria, who lived centuries later and insisted she had swallowed an entire glass piano that might shatter inside her if she moved the wrong way. Others feared their heads would break if touched, or that their bodies would splinter at the slightest bump. Charles lived with his delusion for over 3 decades. He died in 1422 after a long, fractured reign. By then, France was in turmoil, its monarchy weakened, and the seeds of Joan of Arc's rise already on the horizon. Charles' legacy was one of tragedy, a king who began as the beloved and ended as the mad. The story of Charles VI reminds us how fragile power can be and how the human mind can be both brilliant and terrifying. The image of a king wrapped in cushions, frozen in fear that he might shatter, is one of the most haunting images of medieval history. Was he the victim of mental illness centuries before treatment was understood, or was his glass delusion a symbolic reflection of a kingdom itself, fragile and ready to break? That's it for Just a Little Creepy this week. If you like what I do here or not subscribed to my channel, I'd love to have you around, and I'll see you next week. Bye.